speaking about, we, I think, have all been absolutely shocked to see the revelations which public interest lawyers have brought to our attention in respect of the Bahamusa case and others. One area which perhaps hasn't been given so much play in the media is the parallel system of abuse and human rights violations by the private military and security companies operating in Iraq, which operate in a sort of parallel world to the occupying armed forces of the US and the UK and the other state military which are there. And just to give you a sort of bit of background, I thought I'd wind the tape back a few years to find out what these type of companies are, where have they come from, what do we mean when we talk about private military and security companies? Because you'll have all seen, I'm sure, in the papers recently, the trial of Simon Mann, the mercenary who's just starting his 34-year sentence at the pleasure of the Equatorial Guinean authorities for leading one of the old-style type mercenary coup attempts. And throughout the last 30, 40 years, Africa has been the playground, really, of those old-style mercenaries, basically taking the shilling of whoever's going to pay them, going in to try to overthrow, and sometimes overthrowing sitting governments, setting up new people in their place, and getting handsomely paid for their efforts. That old-style mercenary is pretty much at an end. I mean, you'll see Simon Mann as really the last of his breed, because they look around and they think, why? Why should we put ourselves in that type of situation where we're going to end up with long prison sentences if it all goes wrong? When actually, nowadays, they've reinvented themselves, and they're no longer these sort of dogs of war, soldiers of fortune outside the law. Suddenly, we're talking about established companies working within the law. Some of them actually listed on the London Stock Exchange. This isn't some sort of bandit country. You've got kosher, above-board companies who are right there and part of the UK corporate scene. And over the period of the 1990s in particular, you began to see more and more of these firms, often using the same mercenaries as were outside the legal system, bringing them in from the cold, so to speak, forming into companies and becoming part and parcel of the war effort of various countries, particularly the US. The US led the way in using these groups. In the Balkans, for example, in Colombia, they used firms, largely US firms like MPRI or DynCorp, DSL, which was a UK-based firm which was used in Colombia. But gradually through the 1990s, this became a bit more of the established face of war. One of the big developments for the UK situation was the creation of a firm called Sandline, which you may remember from both Papua New Guinea but also Sierra Leone. Lieutenant Colonel Tim Spicer, formerly of the Guards and served in Ulster and everything like that, comes out of the army and sets up this new company called Sandline. And it gets contracts in Papua New Guinea, where he's thrown in prison eventually, gets out of prison in Papua New Guinea, goes over to Sierra Leone and helps in the overthrow of the RUF forces, the revolutionary forces in Sierra Leone, but breaks a UN arms embargo while he does so, which causes great embarrassment to the British government, because here's a British company, actually, as it turned out, operating with the blessing of the British government, overthrowing, not overthrowing, so stopping the overthrow of a particular regime, but breaking a UN arms embargo at the same time. And as a result of this embarrassment, in 2002, the British government published a green paper on the idea of legal controls of these private military companies as they operate, because it was clear if you've got a British company operating outside the law and causing great embarrassment to the British government, and there's no legal comeback on that company, we've got a problem. So in 2002, the Foreign Office puts out this green paper with various different options, saying, you know, we recognise there is a complete gap in the law here. There's no legal restraints or no legal accountability of these companies when they're operating outside the UK. And the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons came back and said, that's good, we like some of the options you've put out, take it further. Since then, deafening silence. So that's 2002. 2003, we invade Iraq and the occupation starts. And suddenly, from being a slightly sort of marginal industry with not terribly much interest to most people, the private military industry becomes big business. In Iraq, from the earliest days, the private military and security companies have formed the second largest body of soldiers, troops, guards, whatever you like to call them, after the US. At their height, there were about 48,000 private military and security guards, employees working in Iraq. You have to distinguish them from the broader group of contractors, which includes the cooks and the logistical support teams, which number more than 100,000. But 48,000 was what the official industry figure was from about 2005, 2006. It's fluctuated since then, but still tens of thousands, and many times more than the British troops involved. At one stage we calculated it was for every British soldier fighting in Iraq, there were 6 mercenaries alongside them doing their jobs as well. And it meant for the UK companies a bonanza. They saw their profits go up within the space of 1 year by 500%. So already, just as a result of this Iraq bonanza, £1.8 billion revenue in 2004 alone. And you get companies like Aegis. Colonel Tim Spicer, who was the head of Sandline, when Sandline became a bit too problematic, he basically just morphed into a new company called Aegis. And Aegis started up in 2003, it had revenue of about $500,000, so nothing much. The next year, it managed to land a $290 million contract with the US Army to coordinate the work of these private military companies in Iraq. Then, fast forward to last year, it got another $500 million, $500 million. 5 British companies like Armour Group, Control Risks, Erinis, those lot have also seen huge amounts of money. Erinis got a $100 million contract for guarding the oil installations of southern Iraq. And a lot of the money they get is not from governments, but actually from other companies. Other companies which want to have close force protection and other things within Iraq, whether that's going to be protecting convoys which are going through more dangerous areas, protecting executives, trailing up other staff and things like that.
And what does C4 do? C4.
C4 or G4? Maybe we'll come back to that in the questions. I don't know the C4, but G4 we can talk about certainly when we come back. Just in the same way as the UK forces have been found to be very, guilty in respect of torture and other human rights abuses there, what's gradually come to the fore is that many of these private military and security companies have also been engaging in human rights abuses in Iraq. And over the years, they've come to the public eye hundreds of cases in which it's not been the military, it's been these private mercenaries who've been guilty of these type of things. The most famous one, infamous one, is Blackwater, which is one of the biggest, most successful US private military companies, which last September was engaged in basically a firefight which they started, opening fire on a traffic jam in Baghdad, where they eventually killed 17 people who were just stuck in traffic. And partly this is because there seem to be these rules which have been put in place where these armed military, paramilitary mercenaries seem to consider it to be